Hello, everyone. This is Beverley Jacob. I am the Indigenous Community Safety Project Consultant, and I have been working with the Ending Violence Association of BC and the Legal Services Society of BC, which have partnered together to bring information to Indigenous communities in the province of BC. And so I've been working with the organization since January 2012, and this project has been funded by the Law Foundation of Ontario. And so this webinar is to provide the information from the project. I developed the curriculum and delivered the project to 12 communities in the province of BC, and part of this work is also to provide this information to the public. And one of the ways is through this webinar. So I want to provide you with the information and to coordinate with you some of the work that was being done and what I developed in the curriculum. And this was the visual framework of the project, and it was based a lot on not only personal experiences, but my professional experiences. I'm actually Mohawk from the Six Nations Grand River Territory, and I was able to, again, use my experiences and my professional experiences to develop this curriculum. And so this was the visual framework that I created first, even before writing any curriculum and writing anything for the project and the actual 3-day workshop. So in the 3-day workshop, I talked about the history and impacts of colonization and how that is the root of violence in Indigenous territories. And then talking about the second module is breaking the silence. And when we talk about violence against Indigenous women and violence in general, is to be able to talk about it and dealing sometimes with the uncomfortableness of talking about violence and ending violence and what it's done in our families and communities. So that was the second module, and talking about how it has an impact not only individually, as an individual woman, Indigenous woman, it could be applied to also to a child or to a man or to an elder in a community, in a family, and so how all of this has an impact on all those different levels. And then talking about the right to be safe. So this is the laws and the policies that are designed to protect victims of violence, and also very specific to the province of British Columbia and the policies that do apply here, and as well the laws that apply in the province. And also the last module is looking at healing, also based at the community level, and that a lot of times, looking at the impacts of colonization and as survivors of violence, women have taken the brunt of this. And so it's going to take the community to come up with a safety plan. Women come up with safety plans all the time who are survivors of violence and having to come up with a plan for themselves and their children when they're going through that process. And that we can't separate ourselves from our families or from our communities or from our nations. When we say that we're from a certain place, that we can't separate ourselves from that. And so also based on the experiences that I've had and hearing from women across the country that, you know, most of the times all they're asking for is safety. And so part of that is then designing and discussing within the community how they can actually develop community safety plans so that there is a safety net for survivors of violence in the community. And then the teaching, so in coming and talking about how traditional knowledge and Indigenous um, teachings and the knowledge holders that have been able to maintain our teachings and all of those um, processes that were designed to teach us about our identity and where we come from, and even about positive relationships and healthy sexual relationships, all has has never gone away. They may have been impacted in some way, but they've never. They're still there. Our elders are still there. The language is still there, and that again is talking about the resilience of our people and how we've been able to deal with all of these horrific genocidal processes and all of those things that have had an impact on our people and our communities and nations. And so that was part of this whole project and the delivery of it in the workshop. So in the first part, talking about the history and impacts of colonization and the root cause of violence in Indigenous, which is the root cause of violence in Indigenous territories. And also acknowledging that this work that's been done is on the unceded traditional territory of the Aboriginal peoples in this province of British Columbia. And so this is me. This is, I'm been raised in my community at Six Nations and was gifted with a lot of knowledge about our traditions and where we come from, and coming from a really strong matrilineal, matriarchal society. And I wanted to start out with this and knowing coming from the East and coming into the nations in this unceded territory of Indigenous nations in this province of British Columbia and the West Coast, that they too come from matrilineal and matriarchal societies. And I just wanted to provide just a little bit of that traditional knowledge and acknowledging the role of the matriarchs, of the Clan Mothers, and knowing that women in our territories and our nations are the backbone of our communities, and that Indigenous women as well have taken the brunt of the impacts of colonization. But that this where I come from, we use wampum belts to remember our oral history, to remember the teachings, and to pass it down from generation to generation. And this belt is called the Women's Nomination Belt, and it acknowledges the role of women and the role of the Clan Mothers as decision makers, as a relationship to our Mother, the Earth, and the connections that we have amongst women, and the connections that we have to future generations, because we as women are the ones responsible for bringing those future nations into this physical world, where we as women carry those babies and carry that future life. And so we have a huge responsibility to the future, and to have that responsibility. So this is just a reminder of how women and Clan Mothers and decision makers in the community as women were honored and respected for their role and for their strength, and that we have to remember that and acknowledge that is a huge part of our inherent equality in our nation. And then I just want, that's just a very tiny piece of the teachings of this belt and the teachings of the great law of peace where I come from. And um, and so then talking about this belt, which is called the Gaswenta, and how this belt itself is my ancestors creating agreements, mutual peace agreements with the early colonizers, and that this belt called Gaswenta, and in literally translated means river of life. And so this belt acknowledges the relationship of the early colonizers and my ancestors. And so this relationship was established with the Dutch, with the French, with the British, and with later with the United States, and that this relationship acknowledged that sacred responsibility to each other. And so this also represented the sacredness of that relationship. So the white beads also represented the spirit of that relationship. And there was 3 rows in between the two rows. And the one purple row represented our canoe, and that it held our laws, our customs, our beliefs, our language, and who we are as a people. And the other line represented the colonizer's ship, and it held their laws, their customs, their beliefs, and recognizing who they are as a people. And that we would live along this river of life, not interfering in each other's way of life, and that there's 3 basic principles of this relationship. And I always acknowledge that as a healthy, these are basic principles even of a healthy relationship. So, so the 3 white rows, and then the 3 rows even in between, representing peace, trust, and friendship. And so having peaceful relations with each other. And trust is a huge concept, a huge principle, that we trust each other, and we trust ourselves and trust where we come from and what that means. And then friendship, that we would maintain that friendship with each other. And so when we're talking about this with respect to that aspect of it, and the relationship that we have with those early colonizers, our people have never forgotten about this relationship, and in fact remember it all of the time. And we have been able to remember our, who we are as a people, and talking about sovereignty and strong nationhood, that this is the root of where that comes from, and that we maintain who we are as a people. And so this relationship, when it comes to the descendants of the colonizers, so this relationship being made with the British, and so when Canada became Canada through the British North American Act, unilaterally made a decision to create this sovereign British colony, and forgetting about this relationship with Indigenous, with my ancestors specifically, and has violated this relationship over and over and over again. So with the establishment of the British North American Act in 1867, so under Section 9124 of the Act, says that the British colony has control over Indians and lands reserved for Indians. And then this was then continued in the Constitution Act of Canada. And so again, they violated this by saying all of a sudden we became wards of the crown, and that we couldn't make decisions on our own, and that they would make those decisions for us. And so that had a huge impact. And in actual fact, it allowed them to create federal laws and provincial laws. And so one of those federal laws is the Indian Act. And the Indian Act was then legislated in 1876. So 9 years after the BNA Act, the Indian Act is established, and they actually had done a lot of, they created even legislation even before the Indian Act, one of them being the Gradual Civilization Act. So having to civilize Indigenous peoples and not understanding this, the role that Indigenous peoples already had in a relationship to lands and territories, and already having a system of governance and having a social system and a legal system and an education system, and just wiping out any kind of processes that identify who we are as a people. And its whole policies was to try to erase us as a people. And so they did attack the women first, because the whole Indian Act system was based on patriarchy, and that in order to be a status Indian, you were a man, or you were a wife, you were married to him, or you were a child of him. And so again, it had a whole impact on identity, and wiping out and attacking the women, because if women made a decision to marry out, they would no longer be considered an Indian. She had no more connections to her lands and territories. And in actual fact, I would call that, and I have called that, a time when the missing women, Indigenous women, started, because we lost a lot of Indigenous women at that time, and losing connections to lands and territories. So I think it's really important to understand that, and how it actually had an impact on Indigenous women and the relationship of her to her lands and territories, except that women did return to their homes. They did return to their lands and territories despite Canadian genocidal laws and policies, and she maintained her resiliency and still had connections and maintained her connections in the community. And so then the Indian Act is changed a little bit later to attack the children, and that's when the whole residential school system was enforced. And so I could talk at length about the impacts of the residential school system itself, and how it historically, the whole relationship between the government to totally erase us as a people and the church's goal to erase any kind of spirituality that was already in existence, and enforce Christian values and beliefs. And so the two were able to work hand in hand to further the goal of assimilation. And so I'm going to end it there, because there's a lot more that can be said, and even specifically how the impact specific on Indigenous women and the whole residential school system. But I'll move forward and talk about the very specific impacts of this colonial system of colonization on individuals, on the family, and as well as how it has an impact on the community and nation, which we are now dealing with this historical trauma. And I'll also explain what that is. So the impacts of colonization, so if we were to look at it from an individual level, so how this has an impact on individual Indigenous men and women. There's been a loss of inherent identity, loss of language and culture, loss of self-respect, self-esteem, self-determination, loss of voice, loss of emotional connection, or also as an example is the inability to express love, the loss of respect for each other. If you lose respect for yourself, you also lose respect for anyone else. And also the loss of traditional roles. So all of those teachings that we have about roles and responsibilities were lost and cut off. And the loss of life. There was so much lives that were lost as a result of this as well, which now we're dealing with all of these self-destructive behaviors. And then looking at how this has had an impact specifically on men. And Bill Mussel did a study, and he presented 7 examples of the consequences of colonization, specifically on First Nations men. And I think some of these can be equally applied to women, but again, the focus here was on men, First Nations men. And so some of those examples are problems with acceptance and trust, relative comfort with rejection, and discomfort with positive recognition, difficulty with emotional expression, few teaching and learning skills, discomfort relating to youth, both male and female, difficulty with intimacy, as well as filling their role as provider. And looking at the impacts on the family as a unit. So even the loss of family connectedness and bonding, so from family to family, how their connectedness was lost. And loss of relationships and even how to relate to each other at the family level. Loss of emotional connection and the ability to express love. Loss of parenting roles and skills, that was a huge impact from the residential school system, because that inherently our education system was to learn from our parents and grandparents and aunties and uncles, and so those roles and skills were lost as a result, specific from the residential school system, and the numbers of families or children that we lost as a result of this. And then looking at it from the whole community and nation, and how our communities at that level have been dealing with the impact of these historical factors for many generations. And the specific losses is the loss of land, the loss of a whole social structure, including culture and identity in its entirety. And this is called cultural genocide. The loss of traditional lifestyle, and the loss of safety. I do know that in the teachings that I've heard that we had inherent safety built within our communities, and that we've lost that feeling of safety now in our communities. And also the loss of language. Language is key to identity. It's key to our families and to our nationhood. And in fact, some of our language are in threat of extinction. And so the challenges remain today. We have all of these systemic barriers. We have all of these problems and negative conditions in Indigenous communities today as a result of all of these impacts of colonization. So we're dealing with high rates of substance abuse, suicide, teen pregnancy, school dropout and low literacy, incarceration, low self-esteem, health problems and despair, violence in interpersonal relationships, child abuse and neglect, and finally family violence, and in particular women abuse. And the fact that this whole colonial system, this colonization has not ended. It continues. The Indian Act continues. The processes of that colonial system still exist. And that today, not only are we dealing with the intergenerational impacts from residential schools, but also the fact that there are more than 3 times the numbers of First Nations children in Canada's foster care system than there were at the height of the residential schools in the 1940s. And so, and this was the work of Cindy Blackstock and the work she's doing with the child welfare system and bringing attention of this and addressing the high numbers of children in the system. So I think it's really important to understand that it still has an impact on our communities today. And so then that brings us to this issue of trauma. Trauma also individually, how it has an impact individually, how it has an impact on our families, as well as our community and nation. So there's this historical trauma theory. And the historical trauma theory is a cumulative and collective psychological and emotional injury sustained over a lifetime and across generations, resulting from massive group trauma experiences. And there has been a lot of research that's been done about historical trauma. And those are some resources that are available to, these are some research through the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. There's Dog Psychologicals, Eduardo Duran and his wife Bonnie Duran both wrote about historical trauma, Sotero, as well as Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart, and she's done a lot of work as well in looking at historical trauma and healing historical unresolved grief. And so a lot of their work is looking at how the experiences from historical trauma as well as how we respond to it, and then how it's been transmitted over many generations, and that intergenerational transmission of historical trauma. And so they've also identified that the response that flows from historical trauma comes through what's called post-traumatic stress disorder, and how this has had an impact psychologically, socially, and physically. And as I was doing these workshops in the community, I was also reminded that this has an impact also spiritually. So psychologically, so things that have an impact on us mentally through the post-traumatic stress disorder or depression or panic and anxiety. And so that the results of that is the ongoing grief that we're feeling, the withdrawal, and then numbness. So we numb ourselves to deal with some of these impacts, and sometimes we withdraw where we just say, no, I don't even want to deal with it. And so we totally withdraw from any discussion or any thinking about it whatsoever. And then socially, so we're dealing with the high rates again of substance misuse, of high rates of suicide in our communities, and the high rates of domestic violence. And so the results of that is the breakdown of our families and all of the separation and the losses that I just referred to earlier. And so this has also had an impact on our bodies physically, and how it has an impact on our health. And so our bodies are also taking the brunt of this historical trauma. So things like nutritional stress and also compromised immune systems. So now, as Indigenous peoples, we have the highest rates of malnutrition, of diabetes, of heart disease, of hypertension, and of cancer. So that is the reality of what's happening even to our bodies. And then there's different types of trauma. So the first type being what's called type 1, or just one single episode of trauma or one event. You know, someone who has died is trauma, a death of a close loved one, or someone who's been in an accident or has been assaulted. So just one incident, one single episode. Then there's type 2, which is repetitive and ongoing. So there's a chronic, like chronic severe neglect in childhood. So I would equate that to what happened in the residential school system. And histories of physical or sexual assaults that could be happening even within families. So this is a repetitive and ongoing process. And so they've included those who are veterans, so impacts from wars, those who have been in prolonged hostage situations, or who have been prisoners of war. And so that this is the type 2, or the repetitive and ongoing trauma. So then we're dealing with Indigenous communities is what's called intergenerational soul wounding, which is this historical trauma on Indigenous peoples. And historical trauma is a relatively new concept in public health. And so that the premise is that populations historically subjected to long-term mass trauma, like colonialism or slavery or war or genocide, exhibit a higher prevalence of disease even several generations after the original trauma occurred. And so the Aboriginal Healing Foundation has done a lot of research and looking at historical trauma, and described it as a historical cluster of traumatic events and as a disease in itself. And that it takes 40 years post ongoing trauma to begin healing. So meaning that there is a constant cycle. That once we deal with one thing, because we're dealing with such soul wounding over many generations, that once we deal with one thing, that we continue to deal with another, and it takes this cycle of healing over a generation. And so then the impact of historical trauma on children. So research has indicated that children who witness violence and abuse, or who may live in fear of family violence, may also experience the same effects of trauma. So for example, if the child witnesses violence, there most likely will be an impact. And it is not unusual that this impact includes symptoms that parallel post-traumatic stress disorder. And that symptoms of exposure to violence are virtually indistinguishable from symptoms of children who have been directly abused. In effect, exposure to violence is a form of emotional and psychological child abuse. So the impacts of historical trauma also on children, and that research has shown that living in a home where a parent is being abused by the other parent has a negative effect on children, whether they're infants or toddlers or primary school age or teenagers. So children who do see, hear, or find out about the abuse are affected by it. It can affect their health, their behavior, their emotional development, their social relationships, and ability to learn in school. And that children may be fearful or worried that something they did or didn't do caused the abuse, or believe that they should have been able to stop it or prevent their mother from getting hurt. So in addition, living in a home where a parent is being abused gives children a negative example of adult relationships that they may copy when they and that the impacts of historical trauma on children, and knowing that they depend on their parents to meet their emotional and physical needs. So when a parent is abusive, the children's needs may be neglected, Just because a child witnesses domestic violence, it doesn't mean that he or she will become an abuser or a victim of abuse as an adult. But their chances of becoming involved in domestic violence when they are older is much higher. So to help end the cycle of abuse, children should receive some form of counseling. And in this province of British Columbia, there are a number of children who witness abuse programs. And these community-based programs provide individual and group counseling services for children who witness the abuse of a parent. Support is also provided to the parent who has been abused by their partner. And how this has an impact on the family, and knowing in Indigenous cultures and nations that we come from an extended family. We have come from a clan, a traditional clan system, and which includes a network of brothers and sisters and aunties and uncles and parents and grandparents and nieces and nephews. And that, so as a result, families within this traditional clan system and this matrilineal descent or culture, the impacts of violence and abuse on a traditional clan system have a deeper impact because of this interconnectedness amongst family and clan members. And the impacts of historical trauma on community and nation, that knowing that we live in a very violent society, and that also that society has permitted violence to occur. And the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People in its study, way back in 1996, noted that that violence has invaded whole communities and cannot be considered a problem of a particular couple or an individual household, and that the primary impact of family violence and abuse in Aboriginal communities is the metastasizing of violence into community life and the gradual generation of a culture of violence, and that the term culture of violence means that the lived patterns of human interactions as well as the beliefs and values that support them are infused with violence to such a degree that violence has become a distinguishing characteristic of family life. And so when we're looking at the symptoms of historical trauma, it is all of these negative influences and these intersectional influences within our community. So dealing with depression and anxiety, isolation, loss of sleep, anger, discomfort around white people, shame, fear and distrust, loss of concentration, substance abuse, violence, and suicide. These are all symptoms of historical trauma. So when dealing with these issues of violence and historical trauma and acknowledging the root of them and acknowledging that violence is an issue in our communities, it's also understanding that that silence, that breaking the silence is part of the process in order to deal with it. So in our community, silence has been mistaken for acceptance. And that what used to be hush, hush, don't tell anyone, is now an epidemic. So it's an understanding that this is happening and that violence is not normal. It's not normal in our societies, and that part of the process is understanding that violence has become normalized, but also the fact that it isn't normal and that things need to be addressed quickly. And so some of the obstacles that an Indigenous woman might face to not disclose abuse and violence might be distrust of the mainstream culture due to the history of residential school abuse and the separation from families and communities, her fear of disclosing the family's secret violence because of her feelings of guilt and shame, as well as the fear of increased violence, and her fear of shame and judgment from family members and community. And also her abusive partner may have a position of esteem and power within the community. So in order to overcome, and this is all fear-based, that the mistrust, that silence and the shame and guilt, all of those feelings that come along with the impacts of violence, is that a whole community healing process also has to occur alongside individual healing. So the traumas and the historical trauma and the post-traumatic stress do continue to impact our community. And so a whole culturally based or nation-based response is needed to address the patterns of abuse and violence within the community. So when we're talking about breaking the silence, it's also being aware of why we are talking about and why we are focused on ending violence against Indigenous women. So once we become aware of the impacts and just even acknowledging statistics, and statistics again are based on those issues that are reported, and knowing that a lot of times the violence against Indigenous women, sometimes they're not reported, and so these statistics may even be higher. So just looking briefly at, and part of this is becoming aware of these statistics, specifically on Indigenous women. So Aboriginal women have were 3.5 times more likely to suffer some form of spousal violence than non-Aboriginal women. And of the Aboriginal women who have experienced family violence, 87% were victims of physical abuse and 57% were sexually assaulted. Aboriginal women are significantly more likely to experience serious forms of violence, including being beaten, choked, sexually assaulted, or threatened with a gun or knife used on them compared to non-Aboriginal female victims. So 54% Aboriginal versus 30% non-Aboriginal. And that Aboriginal women are more than twice as likely to experience emotional abuse at the hands of a current or previous common law or marital partner to non-Aboriginal women. And that Aboriginal women have a 20% chance of being stalked in their lifetime, a number 2 times as high as that of the general population. And that according to the 2009 General Social Survey on Victimization, nearly 67,000 Aboriginal women aged 15 or over self-reported they had been the victim of one or more violent crimes, for example, sexual assault, robbery, and physical assault, in the 12 months prior to the survey. And the proportion of Aboriginal women who reported sexual violence by a current or former spouse was about 2.5 times higher than the proportion of non-Aboriginal women. So then also knowing what the types of violence are, and knowing that there are different types of violence. So our focus in the workshops that we did in the community was specifically on relationship violence as well as sexual violence. And there's a distinction with respect to relationship violence, is that you're in a relationship. And sexual violence is those women who have been attacked and not specifically in a relationship. So also knowing that there's all different kinds of abuse in a relationship, right? So physical, sexual, emotional, psychological and mental abuse, spiritual abuse, economic abuse, and also the exercise of what's called male privilege. And also men who are abusive use their children or use the young people in their families to control, which is what violence is about the abuse of power and control. It is about power and control. And so sexual violence itself, so talking about, sexual assault and rapes and sexual exploitation and coercion, and even specifically sexual exploitation of children. And there are other types of violence, including stalking, bullying and cyberbullying, swarming, dating violence, media violence, racism, homophobia and transphobia, and lateral violence. And then also knowing the warning signs of abuse will increase community members' awareness of when a woman in their community may be in an abusive relationship. So one of the resources that you can access, and again, this is on a project that's being done in Ontario called Runaway, and they have a website and they have all of the resources as well, specific to Indigenous communities. And so they have a lot of really good resources. But this is one I wanted to highlight about identifying how you can identify and help women at the risk of abuse. And that's what is required, is knowing what those warning signs are. And when you know those warning signs that he may be abusive, it's easier to identify how to react or how to become involved. So there are warning signs that he may be abusive, and there are warning signs that she may be experiencing abuse. And there's also other indicators of risk of future harm, so that these risk factors provide information that the danger against her life is greater with these types of factors. So just to highlight a couple of the risk factors, based on the timing that we have for this webinar, is knowing that when we have an alert to these risk factors, that it does help to save a life. And so, you know, there are warning signs. And one of the highest risk factors that I'd like to highlight is during a custody battle, or when a woman makes a decision to leave the relationship. And that is probably the highest risk factor, when she makes a decision to actually leave the relationship. And so having that kind of knowledge is really important. And also having knowledge of issues that do need to be considered when a woman is in a violent relationship, and having that kind of knowledge. And sometimes we are very full aware that a woman is in an abusive relationship because we know, or we understand that she's tried to leave the relationship many times. And we probably also saw her return to her abusive partner. So then sometimes our reaction is to leave her alone and to let her deal with the circumstances of her returning to her abusive partner. And then community members also being well aware that a woman being in a abusive relationship may also feel that it's none of their business to intervene in these cases. But that kind of thinking is what has to stop. And so when talking about knowing these risk factors, and also this is some really good points to consider when thinking about the concerns, or whether there's any hesitation to intervene in an abusive situation. So I'm just going to make reference to a document, again from Runaway, and how they have been able to put this list together. So I want to talk about those. So then, one of the points of concern when you feel that it's none of your business. So it could be a matter of life or death, and that violence in the community is everyone's business. Maybe you don't know what to say, but saying you care and are concerned is a really good start. And I think that's one of the main issues here is about caring. You might make things worse. So doing nothing could also make things worse. Or you might think that it's not serious enough to involve the police. Well, police are trained to respond and utilize other resources. Or you might be afraid his violence will turn to you or your family. Well, then speak to her alone, and then let the police know if you do receive threats. Or you think she really doesn't want to leave because she keeps going back to the relationship. Well, maybe she doesn't have the support that she needs. Or you're afraid she will become angry with you. Well, yeah, maybe, but then she will know that you care. Or you're afraid he will become angry with you. Maybe, but it also gives you the chance to offer your help. Or you feel that both of them have been your friends and are your friends. Well, then you need to think about that one of your friends is being abused and lives in fear. Or you believe that if she wanted help, she would have asked for help. Well, she may have been too afraid or maybe too afraid and ashamed to ask for help. Or you believe that if he wanted help or wanted to stop his behavior, he would. Well, he too may be ashamed to ask for help. Or you think that it's a family matter. Well, it's not a family private matter. It isn't when someone is being hurt and someone you love is being hurt. So understanding those, understanding those concepts of intervening is really, really important. And also, there are many reasons why women stay in abusive relationships or do not call for help. And again, it is all about dealing with fear, or having hope, or a real belief that the abuse will end. And also, there's this whole cycle of violence, right? And it's called the makeup period or the honeymoon stage after the outbreak of violence. And that whole honeymoon stage intensifies the emotional attachment to her partner. She may be financially dependent on him. She may fear for the safety of her children, or also fearing that her children will be taken into government care, or being afraid of losing her home, and fearing for the safety of her pets or her farm animals, or being afraid that no one will actually believe that the abuse happened. And also lacking social support because of isolation from her family and friends, or not knowing about her rights or the services that are available to her, or even fearing the whole legal system itself. Feeling pressure from her family or friends to stay, feeling pressure or blame from her community, or living in a rural area with these services. Some communities don't have any services whatsoever. Or living in a small town community where everyone knows everyone's business. And maybe she speaks her language fluently and she has difficulty speaking English, or she is unfamiliar with society in general and is not fearing of coming into that system. And also a woman with disabilities also faces particular challenges. And studies show that women with disabilities are twice as likely as women without disabilities to be victims of violence. And that women with disabilities have more difficulty finding employment and are more likely to face poverty. And that women with disabilities may be dependent on her partners for the daily care and financial support, making it especially difficult to protect herself from abuse or to leave the relationship. Also, women or men in same-sex relationships may be abused by their current or former partner, or even the father of their children. So being abused in a same-sex relationship can be complicated, again, by fear, not only of homophobia, and if the relationship is disclosed to the police or service providers, but also the fears of every other parent. Of losing their children or losing their family home if there is no formal or legal agreement between the partners. So we're moving on and talking about this project partnership between the BC Lions and the Ending Violence Association of BC. So they started a campaign, and it's called Be More Than a Bystander, and talking about breaking the silence on violence against women. And so this whole be more than a bystander, right? So you're a bystander is someone who sees or knows someone who is either acting abusively or watching the abuse happen. So you're standing back watching what's going on. And it's also not just physical or sexual abuse. It's also things like inappropriate or cruel jokes or sexist comments or catcalls, etc. So I want to show this video of this partnership of the BC Lions and EVA BC, and it demonstrates the project and what it means to them as men who are the football players for the BC Lions. And so they're visiting schools across the province with this campaign. And so yeah, I want to show you this video. So here it is.
Feel it coming in the air, hear the screams from everywhere. I'm addicted to the thrill. It's a dangerous love affair. Victory's within the mile. Almost there, don't give a fuck. Who gon' run this town tonight?
It is my pleasure to present the 99th Grey Cup to your hometown BC Lions!
The BC Lions are stepping up and speaking out against violence against women, which affects more than 50% of women. As a husband, brother, and leader, I know it's important for us to work together to stop this from continuing. Speaking up and being more than a bystander is the first step.
As men, we need to hold each other accountable, be respectful of the young women in our community, and take responsibility for an environment that is safe for all of us.
Being more than a bystander isn't a superhero approach. Countering violence with more violence isn't the answer.
We all have the power to create a community that we are proud to be a part of. So look out for each other, keep each other safe, and have a great time living and learning.
An incident occurred in my own house that I had to deal with, and fortunately for me, I was old enough that I could deal with it on my mother's behalf. And you know, there's times that's not the case at all, right?
You know, it happens every day. You know, a lot of young people are seeing their parents being abused, and I was too ashamed, but I want to let them know that, hey, this is what's going on right now isn't right, you know, and they need to speak up.
Knowing that even as a bystander I have an opportunity to make a difference, that's where it becomes powerful, and I think that's where it reaches so many more people.
With the wife and daughters that I love very much and a lot of important women in my life, this is a program that will help them and women everywhere.
The bystander approach is not a superhero model. We're not suggesting that the solution to this problem is getting men or women jumping into, to situations to rescue women who are being abused. It's not like that. It's more from a social justice perspective, is that if you're in a position to interrupt abusive behavior or challenge abusive behavior, then you do it, and you think about creative ways that you can do it.
And so my ability to speak up and say something or to do something in that situation, as well as all of us, makes a huge difference.
And what's good about this training is that it showed us that it's not that cut and dry. It's not either step up and confront or do nothing. There's any number of other options you can take that can be just as effective in preventing the situation from going in a direction you don't want it to.
I think after being more and more introduced to the topic and knowing that an overwhelming majority of these instances are committed by men, and it's an action that a man is making against a woman. In a large majority of cases, it's very much a men's issue. It's and it starts from a mindset of the way a man respects or disrespects a woman, and that's where we can make a difference. Is in changing that mindset. It's not all about being tough and gruff all the time, but sometimes making difficult decisions that and understand are right. And I think that's why we recognize the platform that we have and want to be able to make a difference.
I'm J.L. LaRose from One Arrow First Nations. As of 2010, there are more than 582 known reports of missing or murdered Aboriginal women in Canada, with BC recording more than any other province or territory.
I'm Sean Gore of the BC Lions. In Canada, it's estimated that every year, over 800,000 children witness a woman being abused. This is not just a woman's issue.
I'm not okay with what you're saying. Hey, leave her alone. From one guy to another, the way you're talking about women just isn't cool. These are just a few ways to speak up and be more than a bystander. Break the silence on violence against women.
Grey Cup champion BC Lions. Give them a big round of applause. How many of you guys and girls have women in your life who are important to you? Yeah, everybody, right?
I think it's wonderful that a bunch of tough guys that can take the field are up there talking about how important it is that we're able to respect everybody.
Not a lot of people come to talk about that kind of thing usually.
Everything that was said was realistic and that it really does happen and that we could make a difference.
I thought it was an excellent presentation, and it's definitely an issue that needs to have more attention brought to it.
They give you a lot of they give you scenarios and they give you options of what you can do, and I thought that was pretty cool.
I just learned a lot about how to deal with the situation.
I think it really resonated with a lot of the kids to have football players here, people that they kind of know and in the public.
Like the BC Lions came in, and it really just drove it home that this is really important, and if they care, then so should everybody else.
It's nice that they support us because it can be hard sometimes. Most women have a hard time speaking up about the things that have happened, so it's really great that they come out and help.
From the Lions, thank you, and take this stuff seriously and take it, run with it. You guys be the leaders of tomorrow.
Hey, what's wrong with you? Leave her alone. I gotta tell you, I'm definitely not cool with the way you talk about women. I'm Andre Douglas of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and those are some of the things we can say to be more than a bystander. Break the silence on violence against women.
I'm Chris Svekovich of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Dating violence happens even more often than spousal violence, and young women are most at risk. But if you think this is just a women's issue, you're wrong. It's a men's issue because it's men who are committing this violence. And that's why I'm asking you, be more than a bystander. Break the silence on violence against women.
So this video is really powerful in talking about the role of men and the role of being more than a bystander. So taking that initiative in dealing with safety and preventing violence and understanding what it means. So in applying this concept of being more than a bystander, and putting this as a new approach by community members within the community. So if we are aware of the risk, then we need to understand how we might be of assistance to women and her children who are in abusive situations. So coming at it from a community level, and where each community member can be supportive and provide her with many options. So, for example, talk to her about what you see and let her know that you are concerned. And tell her you believe her and it's not her fault. Encourage her not to confront her partner if she is planning to leave. Her safety must be protected. And also, one of the basic being of help is to provide child care while she seeks help. Part of it is her having to develop her own safety plan and offer your home as a safe haven to her children and her pets. And then if she does accept your offer, you do not let her partner in. It's about safety. Also, encourage her to pack a small bag with important items and keep it stored at your home in case she needs it. Know that you or she can call for help at the Assaulted Women's Helpline through an Aboriginal service provider, an anti-violence service provider, a local shelter if you have one, or in an emergency, the police. Also, there's many ways to help. Not only finding the information on the written materials about the ways she can protect herself. That's really important to have that material. Also, if you want to get further advice about a situation, anybody can go and ask for information to contact a local women's shelter or an anti-violence support worker or support program. They can help. They may suggest you get more involved as a trained volunteer to help other women in your community. That too is an option. So then moving forward and talking about the right to be safe. So these are the laws and the policies related to sexual and relationship violence, and also specific to the criminal code offenses, and also family law and child protection. So in talking about criminal law specifically, that these laws about sexual offenses have changed a lot over the last 20 years. And these changes do show that society is beginning to recognize how widespread the problems of sexual assault and child sexual abuse are, and how traumatic these crimes are for the victims. The laws now acknowledge that both men and women can be victims of these crimes, and that both men and women commit sexual offenses. There was a change in 1992. So previous sexual history of a victim of sexual assault can no longer be automatically brought up in court. And this is an important change because often victims felt like they were the ones on trial. And this change now gives more protection to the rights of the victim, so that where her previous sexual relationships have no relation to the crime that took place, it cannot be brought into court. Also, the corroboration of a sexual assault victim's testimony is no longer necessary. This means that although it is usually better to have a witness or some other supporting evidence of the crime, the victim's testimony may now be considered enough on its own to convict someone of a sexual offense. Also, another change that it used to be that unless a victim reported a sexual assault to the police immediately after the incident, this was called a recent complaint. There was a chance that her testimony might not be believable because of the delay in reporting the crime. Now, often a victim of a sexual assault is in a state of shock right after the incident, and also may be too frightened, too confused, or just too overwhelmed by the whole situation to go to the police right away. So now, there is no statute of limitations on sexual offenses. This means that sexual assault that happened many years ago can still be reported and prosecuted in court. Also, further changes to the laws about child sexual abuse were introduced in 1988 and most recently in 2008 by the Tackling Violence Crime Act. And these new laws offer greater protection of the rights and safety of children and young adults, and it changed the age of consent as well. The important changes to the laws represent some very positive steps towards a greater recognition by society of the seriousness of sexual offenses and the impact they have on victims. As with any of the laws in Canada, understanding them also seems to be the hardest part. So the criminal offenses under the criminal code include assault and the various levels of sexual assault. So level 1, simple sexual assault. Level 2, simple sexual assault with a weapon. Level 3, aggravated sexual assault. And also criminal harassment, which is stalking. And also there's child sexual abuse and exploitation, the criminal offenses against that. So these are all the sections under the criminal code. Sexual interference, invitation to sexual touching, sexual exploitation, incest, child pornography, luring a child, exposure, procuring, bestiality, and also child sex tourism. So these are some of those offenses. And when we're talking about criminal offenses, the issue is about consent. And so there is no consent obtained if the victim submits because of physical force or threats made against her or someone else, fraud, or the exercise of authority or the abuse of a position of trust, power, or authority. And also no consent is obtained if someone else agrees on behalf of the victim, the victim is mentally incapable of consenting. For example, she was either drugged or drunk or otherwise lacked the mental capacity to consent. And also the victim shows lack of agreement, either by her words or conduct. And that the victim does initially consent, but then shows lack of agreement to continue. So then that is when there is also no consent. So further, under the family law, so there is a new provincial family law that came into effect on March 18, 2013. And the Legal Services Society has many really good publications that assist in understanding what the family laws are. So there's a quick reference tool, and again, that's the link to that that publication, as well as the guide to the new BC Family Law Act. So that's the act itself. And again, a link identified here to the act itself. So just a general overview of the importance of family law and the changes as a result of the issues of violence in relationships. So knowing that frontline and service providers know, and the literature indicates, that violence against women escalates during or immediately after separation or divorce. And also that murder of a female partner is most likely to occur in the context of marital separation or divorce. So it is extremely important that family law take into account the safety of women and their children. And also knowing that only a small minority of women who are victims of domestic violence do report to the police. So sometimes the only support or protections that many of these women seek out are accessed through the family law system. So family law protection orders and referrals from justice personnel are some of the changes within the law, the new law. And also that the family law system effectively address safety for women who are victims of domestic violence. And the importance of this new family law is that women's experience is that the family justice process does not necessarily result in justice or protection for them if they are victims of domestic violence. We know that the courts can be used by abusive men to further victimize women in a number of ways, and that out-of-court mediation processes can be used to further disempower women who are victims of violence. And it is essential that the whole system, that the justice system, take into account these particular vulnerabilities of women who are victims of violence and their children, and that enhance rather than further threaten their safety. Also changes in the law, in the Family Law Act, is that the court will not be the primary or first approach taken to resolve family disputes. So the family law provides a range of non-court options for resolving family conflict, while at the same time improving available court responses. So at the same time, the family law also includes an overarching focus on safety for children, and specifically takes into account family circumstances that include family violence. And also the Act provides women who are going to court regarding parenting arrangements an avenue to address issues of violence, power, and control. The legislation takes account of the circumstances in which the child lives, including current and past parenting arrangements, and the nuances of the dynamics of coercion and violence. And again, protection orders are also key to assisting survivors of violence. So using the protection of peace bonds and family law protection orders. And again, here is a link to some resources under the Legal Services Society website for peace bonds and family protection orders. So again, this is just a general overview of what peace bonds are. It is a preventative order designed to stop an assault that might occur, and the judge orders a peace bond in criminal court. So a peace bond is achieved in the criminal court system. And that to get a peace bond, one does not have to prove that her partner or ex-partner assaulted her. She only has to show that she has reasonable fear that he will injure her or a member of her family, harm a pet, or damage her property. And also anyone who knows about her situation, for example, a police officer, can apply for a peace bond on her behalf. However, she may have to apply for one herself and to do it herself. So she would actually have to go to the provincial criminal court and ask that a justice of the peace issue a peace bond against her partner or ex-partner. And also, there's protection orders now under the Family Law Act, and they can be applied for by an at-risk family member or by someone on behalf of that at-risk family member. There does not need to be a family law litigation process or a legal process already underway for the protection order application to be made. The fact that criminal charges may be pending against the abuser does prevent the making of the new civil protection order. And the application for the new protection order may be made without notice to the abuser, although he does have the right to apply to have the order set aside or buried. And also the new protection orders may include terms restraining the abuser from direct or indirect communication or contact going to the family home, stalking behavior, possession of weapons. So these are conditions that could be attached to a protection order. Also, directions to police to remove the abuser from the family home and seize weapons may also be included, as well as reporting requirements for the abuser. So unless the court orders otherwise, the protection order remains in force for 1 year after the date it was made, and that either party may apply to have the terms of the order changed or terminated. In order to decide whether to issue a protection order, the court has to consider a number of prescribed risk factors, including any history of family violence towards the at-risk family member and her perception of risk. And if there is a child involved, the court must consider whether they should also be included as a protected party under the order. And also the protection orders can be enforced only by the police. And that the new family law orders also have an expiry date to aid enforcement. And also if there's a conflict between any civil or criminal protection orders and a non-protection order, such as a conduct order or a custody order, the protection order takes precedence. So what this means is that if there's a conflicting order that is suspended to the extent of the conflict. For example, if a parent has parenting time, but later bail conditions prohibit contact with the child, the safety-related bail conditions prevail, and there is to be no contact with the child until the inconsistency between the orders is resolved. If, on the other hand, the bail conditions only prohibit contact or communication with the other parent, then the situation is more complex. If a family is covering the terms and ensuring that if the child is at risk, they are included in any bail, no contact conditions. So, also talking about the laws protecting children. So the Child and Family Services the Child, Family and Community Services Act is the legislation that protects children. So where there's a reference in the Act to the best interest of a child, all relevant factors must be considered in determining the child's best interest. For example, the child's safety, the child's physical and emotional needs and level of development, the importance of continuity in the child's care, the quality of the relationship the child has with a parent or other person, and the effect of maintaining that relationship. Also, the child's cultural, racial, linguistic, and religious heritage, the child's views, the effect on the child if there is a delay in decision making. And this is another really good resource, again, by legal services. And so this is the actual child protection process. And I think it's really good to get a copy of this if there is someone who is going through that process to understand the process itself. So when we're talking about, those are all of the laws that I talked about. So now these are all the provincial policies for increasing safety. So these are all the policies, violence against women in relationships policy, the referral policy for victims of power-based crimes, family violence, sexual assault, and criminal harassment, information sharing, the E Division RCMP, violence in relationships, the primary aggressor policy, and also the E Division RCMP, sexual offenses, third-party reporting of sexual assault. So I'm going to highlight these quickly. So the violence against women in relationships policy was developed in December 2010. And so the primary purpose is defined as follows: to ensure an effective, integrated, and coordinated justice and child welfare response to domestic violence. The goal is to support and protect those individuals at risk and to facilitate offender management and accountability. And then the policy-specific application to spousal abuse cases played a pivotal role in helping to make the critical distinction between the criminal justice system's treatment of spousal abuse as a criminal matter and its historical treatment of spousal abuse as a private matter. So this policy sets out the protocols, roles, and responsibilities for the justice system personnel, including the police, Crown Counsel, corrections staff, including bail supervisors and probation officers, and victim service workers. And this policy, which we call VAWR policy, guides the work of child protection workers in managing the existence of violence against women in relationships and its impact on children. And also the strengths of this policy is that it acknowledges the importance of justice personnel and service providers working collaboratively and making effective referrals. And that service providers do include transition house programs, stopping the violence counseling programs, children who witness abuse programs, outreach and multicultural outreach services, health services, and immigrant settlement services. This policy also sets out the responsibilities of police as taking a lead role, treating violence in relationships as priority tasks, conducting thorough investigations, referring to victim services, identifying highest risk cases, recognizing consistent risk indicators, making breaches a priority, collaborating with others, and reporting on children who are present. So the referral policy, and there is a link to the referral policy, which is here. Again, you have access to this this webinar at all times now, and so you can you have that link there. So the referral directives of this policy are community-based victim service programs are the contracted primary service providers for victims of power-based crimes. And also in this province, only larger communities have community-based victim service programs. Police and police-based victim service programs should refer all victims and survivors of power-based crimes to those community-based victim service programs in an appropriate and timely manner. In cases where the police-based victim service program is the first point of contact with the victim, for example, at the crime scene, the police-based program will refer victims and survivors to the community-based victim service program as soon as practicable. If there is no community-based victim service program serving the community, police will refer victims and survivors to the police-based victim service program. And the referral of victims and survivors to the victim service programs is contained in all of these provincial and police force policies, including the VAWR policy, including the RCMP E-Division policy, their operational manual, violence in relationships and VAWR policy, as well as the victim service programs. And there's also included in the municipal police department policy and procedure. And in many communities, there is actually no police-based or community-based victim service programs. So victims and survivors should refer to Victim Link at 1-800-563-0808 or other local services. And the detachment commanders must meet with the local agencies contracted by the ministry to deliver police-based and community-based victim services to discuss policy obligations and ensure that referral protocols are in place, and to ensure that roles and responsibilities are clearly understood. So when talking about information sharing, so being able to share information of a particular survivor or victim of violence. So privacy laws generally require consent before personal information such as name and phone numbers can be shared. And that the RCMP Victim Services Policy also requires that RCMP and RCMP-based victim services obtain the victim's consent before referring her to victim services. So to help address the victim's immediate need for support and advocacy, first responders in some communities ask the victim if she objects. And if she does not, this is documented and the necessary information is shared with community-based victim services. But if there are cases identified as high risk, it may be necessary to proactively share victim contact information or other critical information in order to keep the victim, her children, or other people involved safe. So this proactive, timely information sharing with the victim and among sectors is a crucial component of a coordinated response to risk assessment and women's safety at the local level. And also, there are federal and provincial privacy laws that allow for personal information to be shared without consent when in the public interest, which is under the Privacy Act, or there are significant health or public safety concerns, which is under the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. So information about risk should be communicated in a timely manner among responders on an ongoing basis, and that responders need to be aware of evidence-informed risk and safety factors and use validated approaches as a structure to inform their professional judgment and act as prompts for further questioning, analysis, and risk management. So the E-Division RCMP, this is a violence and relationships policy. Note that violence and relationship cases must be investigated thoroughly as a priority, whether or not the victim is reluctant to cooperate. And these cases are supervised to ensure that all appropriate actions have been taken. And in all cases where a child is part of the family, the police will notify child welfare personnel and provide information concerning the incident, regardless of whether the child is present at the scene or witnesses the violence. And that the detachment commander is responsible to participate or designate participation in a multi-agency coordinated community-based effort to reduce and prevent the incidences of violence in relationships and to improve public awareness. And so the strengths of this violence and relationship policy, so that all reported breaches of protective conditions of criminal and civil orders relating to violence in relationships require immediate response. When a case is highest risk, justice and child welfare personnel will provide heightened, coordinated, and collaborative case management response. Work with others to develop protocols for a coordinated response, and using an independent interpreter for both parties to ensure clear communication, accurate statement taking, and to ensure that the victim does not feel intimidated. So in recent years, this next policy is called the primary aggressor policy. The police have been identifying both partners in a relationship as suspects in the incidences of spousal abuse, spousal violence. And the terms commonly used to refer to this issue are dual arrest or dual charges. And sometimes women who have been victims of violence are arrested as primary aggressors. However, this primary aggressor clause in the policy states that members are cautioned against accepting an argument of mutual aggression. Each case should be fully investigated to determine what happened, who is most vulnerable, and who, if anyone, should be arrested. And that members should identify, arrest, and charge the primary aggressor where reasonable and probable grounds exist in accordance with the criminal code. And that further points of this policy that members should be prepared to support their identification of the primary aggressor with observations and reasons, including the intent of the law and policy designed to protect victims of relationship violence, who has suffered the most extensive physical and or emotional damage and received treatment for that injury, who has superior physical strength and skills for effective assault, and what is the history and pattern of abuse in the relationship. So police are required to go through that policy. And next is the E Division RCMP Sexual Offenses Third-Party Reporting of Sexual Assault in 2008. So this policy provides a consistent policy across the province for anonymous reporting of sexual assault by particularly marginalized women who may otherwise never give evidence, and allows victim control over police involvement and allows for tracking of serial predators. And the third-party reporting policy requires a local protocol between community-based victim assistance, police, and all other agencies that may make referrals. So how it works is that a community-based victim assistance worker files information of the victim in a confidential locked file. Information of the perpetrator is forwarded to the police. In the event that another sexual assault by the perpetrator is reported, the police may come back to speak to the first victim. So those were all of the policies and the laws designed to protect survivors of violence in relationship and sexual violence. So the last module of the curriculum is called community healing. So this is then where we're taking the responsibility back at the community level. But also understanding about how this whole cycle of violence is occurring in our communities, and also understanding, again, the resiliency and the strength of Indigenous peoples. And also to understand the stages, the grieving stages and the healing stages that we are at. But then also changing our language to the positive, and that what this process is and what we now have to go through is this victorizing stage. So understanding that as Indigenous peoples, we are taking the lead in healing. We are taking the lead in being winners in this process. We have survived so much. Indigenous people have survived so much impacts of colonization and the whole genocidal processes to try and annihilate us as a people. But we, as Indigenous peoples, have to acknowledge the strengths and the resiliency of our people. So then now that we talk about the victorizing state. So meaning that we victorize our lives rather than focusing on being perpetual victims. So that's one way to do that. And actually the most logical place to start this is to celebrate our victory and our survival at home. And again, going back to this whole module, that when we're talking about the teachings and the knowledge and the traditional knowledge is what helped us to maintain that resilience and to talk about how we are winners in this, because we have been able to survive so much. And also acknowledging and giving thanks to all of the elders and the knowledge holders who kept it and who were able to transfer that knowledge to the next generation despite those colonial processes, genocidal processes. So then talking about the healing in our communities, that it has to work along with individual and family healing. So that has to happen to address historical unresolved grief and its present manifestation. So then a commitment to healing the past, to address the resultant trauma, to prevent the continuation of such atrocities in the present, to provide the positive and healthy community activism, to stop and prevent the social pathologies of suicide, of homicide, of domestic violence and child abuse and alcoholism and drug abuse that's so prevalent in our communities and also in society at large today. So a whole positive and healthy community is needed to stop the cycle of violence. That when an individual heals, there's a ripple effect that has an impact on family and community. And when a community heals, it provides that safety net that's needed for children and for future generations. So this is the safety net, and these are the programs and services and service providers in a community. This is an example that can provide that safety to survivors of violence. So all of these services may be used, and so it's important to work together within a community to understand this whole cycle of violence and to provide that safety net for her and her children. So within the workshops on the last day, on the third day, we talked about the goal of coordination and building a community safety plan. So that the goal of coordination is to facilitate change and to increase safety. And that the goal for change to be complete has to include people, it has to include a process, and has to include a structure. So this again is a really good tool that was brought to the communities, and it's about building those collaborations with all service providers, being able to bring everyone together. And one of the key, again, the key principles is trust. So I really like this tool, and so you now have access to it. It's there. You can use this tool as a way of building a collaborative team together, a safety committee in the community, so that everyone in the community are stakeholders. Everyone has a shared vision. Everyone around the table has expertise that can be brought and to address these issues of safety in the community, as well as teamwork strategies, that no one is working on an individual level, that everybody is working as a team, and that there is open communication, both listening and speaking, being able to communicate with trust, having motivated partners in those collaborative efforts, and also having sufficient means, whatever that means, the capacity in the communities, the resource that's required, and also building the action plan. So an action plan is the next step. So you build this successful collaboration team, you bring everyone together, you talk about what all of these aspects of a successful collaboration, how everybody can be part of that process. But then planning for change. So the issue that you want to change, that you want, is the safety in the community. So that's where you look at, well, where are we at now? Are people feeling safe in the community? What is our vision? Well, the vision is that you want to have safety in the community, and that you're part of that community, and that every individual person in the community is part of building that safety and building this collaborative team. So how will we get there? It is being able to bring those people, those key people together, and also taking the responsibilities within the community at the community level. And then how will we monitor our success? So that's evaluating things all the time, and being able to identify, if there's changes that have to come, if there's things that need to be changed, how to make things better, so that you're constantly going through this cycle and looking at, okay, so where are we at now? What do we need to do? What's our vision? How will we get there? And how will we monitor our success? So it's a constant cycle. So then the last effort is to also build the community safety plan, and it's much like a strategic plan. So identifying the actions that need to be done to create safety in the community, who is part of that plan, who is going to do it, and when. So building a short-term, medium-term, long-term plan, and planning it with the collaborative team, bringing everybody together to build the safety plan. So on the last day of our workshops in the 3 days in the community, we left people with the tool to build the safety plan and identifying the actions that need to be part of that plan. And it was a first step in the community, if it was one of the first steps. In some communities, they were already developing safety plans, and so many times this assisted in guiding that process through and revitalizing some of those issues. So that's it for the webinar. This is my contact information. You can reach me at Indigenous Violence Association of BC. I want to thank you for listening. My language, we say Nyala. Thank you very much for listening. When we did this webinar, we actually did it live, and there were many questions that came from some of the participants during the live webinar. And one of the questions was whether or not this PowerPoint can be provided to anyone who requests it. And yes, it can be. If you could email me, I can, we'll have a PDF format of the PowerPoint, and we can email that to you. But also, one of the questions was about the changes to the Family Law Act, and whether there's worry that more Aboriginal children will be removed if violence is reported, and which gives the Ministry of Child and Family Development more power to remove children from homes. And I think one of the key responses, and this came from Lynn McBride from Legal Services Society, is the reminder that as soon as a social worker comes into the home and it starts to ask questions about about the children, or just first access, is that you don't have to wait for MCFD to begin an action. That as soon as someone comes to your home and starts asking questions, that you can apply through legal services, through legal aid, to get legal advice, so that a lawyer can actually speak on your behalf and to provide guidance and to talk to also to MCFD. And so it's really important. And so that's where you can access the services of Legal Services Society of BC. And then also there was another question about the intergenerational impacts of trauma and how that has had an impact today. And yes, it does. The intergenerational impacts of trauma continues, and as this presentation has shown, those intersectional influences, and that there continues to be the actual impacts in our community today. So if you also have any other questions as a result of listening to this PowerPoint webinar, you can contact me at the email there, jacobs@endingviolence.org. So again, thank you very much for listening.